Okay, welcome everybody to the Northwood University Freedom Seminar. This is the final part of our series, which began in February with an international global perspective, and then continued in March with problems with public policy and business policy affecting economic freedom. And then this final component, which deals in particular with entrepreneurship and economic development. So I'm glad that you could make it. It's my pleasure today to introduce to you Dr. Timothy G. Nash, from Northwood University. He shows up everywhere from athletics, development, academics. He came here as a young man, as a student, and we're so happy that he made Northwood one of his life's passions. And he has contributed so much to the education of generations of students. He's been a role model for me. Today, he is the director of the McNair Center for Free Enterprise and Entrepreneurship at Northwood University. And that center, under his direction, is having fantastic influence on public policy, not only in our own state, but across the country. With the studies that they produce each year, he's making a big difference for all of us. So it's my pleasure to have him at the Freedom Seminar once again. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Timothy G. Nash.
Well, first and foremost, Dale, it's an honor to be here. Thank you. And it's also important to note that you're a district, so that you're halfway, beyond halfway in your life. We want to celebrate all your successes. And one of the great hires in my life was Dr. Dale Nash. So, Dale, thank you for all this work you're doing here with the Freedom Seminar and with our students leading our economics department. Ladies and gentlemen, I can't tell you how many reasons I have in my mind for being here, but it's an honor and a pleasure to be with you. I am a Detroit boy. I'm not a suburbanite. I'm a very proud Detroiter. I grew up about 4 miles from here, Roseville Park area. If you head back down the Southfield Freeway, you get off the Grand River, those are my stomping grounds. I just want to say this, I've never convicted, but this area is extremely, it warms my heart to be back here. And what I would like you to think about as you analyze my talk today, first and foremost, it is, when you write something and you have collaborators, it allows you to validate a number of things. And I was talking with Dr. McDonald before we started, and there's a lot of parallels that he and I haven't even talked about in great detail, but it's an honor, and I want to recognize Dr. McDonald, one of the best presidents, not just in the U.S., but globally. Let's give him a round of applause here. And then the other co-author is a man that is a hero of America. Alan West, Colonel West, holds an honorary doctorate from Northwood University. He's a former U.S. congressperson from the state of Florida, and he's ran for the governorship of the state of Ohio, or I'm sorry, of Texas. And he's just a top-notch defender of freedom. So when you have a group of co-authors that are of the caliber that I was pleased to work with on this paper, it's something that's enjoyable beyond my ability to put it into words. So what I'd like to just simply say to you, write down some key points here. This is getting back to my teaching days. I haven't taught a class in a long time. But why don't you write these words down? Put down Nash's youth. Put down 1967.
right down Ypsilanti. You where Ypsilanti is? Go west, young man, from here. It's right by Ann Arbor. Right down Ypsilanti, okay? Right down Colchester. Right down railroads. Plural. Okay? Right down, graduated from high school at 15. Right down Edinburgh. Right down Euler. Right down tobaccoist father. Put this next thing in quotes. I want the real McCoy. Or you can word it, it was often phrased, is this the real McCoy? And then the last point will be the Selig Center. S-E-L-I-G, Selig Center. Now, you don't have to worry about the spelling because all this stuff is in the article, but if you have any questions, I'm sure you'll ask them during Q&A. I know that when I was more involved with the Freedom Seminar, you had to write a summation of each of the speakers, and then the speakers may have helped you with a topic that you might have done your research paper on, and so hopefully I'll help you in all of those areas, help you summarize this talk, and then give you some ideas as it relates to doing a research paper. So what I'd like to say to you is that for me, every year for a number of years, and the last 3 or 4, I've had the honor of working with Kent on papers regarding Black History Month and papers regarding entrepreneurship. The last couple that we've done, we presented a paper, put one together on Booker T. Washington, one of the great African-American entrepreneurs and educators in the history of the world, not just the United States. And recently we did the real McCoy, Elijah McCoy. And it means a lot to me growing up because, again, I grew up in Detroit. Grew up on one side of was born on one side of the city, moved from the east central side, Poletown, I'm half Polish, to the west side. And I love the city of Detroit. I had incredible years of growing up in the city of Detroit. And it was a tough city, but it was a great city, a vibrant city. It is one of the greatest cities in the history of the world in terms of its history. You know, we've been down a little bit of late, but you know, we're the arsenal of democracy. World War II never would have been won without the city of Detroit and the surrounding areas, going all the way out to Ypsilanti and the Ford plane plant where they made B-17s. But here we're gonna get real, as we say. Detroit's history isn't perfect, and anybody that wants to say that it is or wants to try to sweep things under the rug, you ought not do it. I was 9 years old, and my family was a real minority partner in a family-owned cottage in Colchester, Ontario. And I'll never forget, it was a Sunday, and my dad and I were, with my other siblings, packing up our station wagon. We called it the family truckster before Chevy Chase did. And we were getting ready to load Mom and Dad and 8 kids into a station wagon and leave Colchester, where some of our relatives were there. And this wasn't a big place. We had 30 people in there. We'd sleep in sleeping bags. We had tents outside. It was just a great place to go in the summer because it was on Lake Erie. We had Big Beach and Little Beach in Colchester, Ontario. And we got into the car and a Canadian trooper pulled up and knew that we were heading back to Detroit. And they were just wonderful people, as we all know Canadians are. And they got to know who was there in the summer, and they looked out for your cottage. And he pulled my dad aside and gave my dad some advice. And my dad didn't say anything to us until we got to Windsor. And then we crossed the Ambassador Bridge. And we crossed the Ambassador Bridge into Detroit. And the city of Detroit was on fire. And so 1967 is the 1967 riots. And the 1967 riots were a terrible thing. But they happened because terrible things had been happening. You know, the 67 riots happened because there were a lot of laws and a lot of prejudice against minorities and especially against blacks. And you had bars that were owned by whites. And there were a lot of bars that didn't let blacks into those bars. And so what happened, entrepreneurial blacks started their own bars because they couldn't get a license to start a bar. And so an illegal bar was called a blind pig. And you know why it was called a blind pig? Anybody want to say? What's a derogatory term for a police officer? A pig, right? It was called a blind pig because the police turned a blind eye to the bar. And they let this bar operate, and it was a place, might have been in somebody's garage, might have been in a business, but it was an illegal bar. And what happened was they were, the alleged story is that they'd get protection, and the police would allow the activity to go on. And African Americans were gathering in a bar that they felt comfortable. And some confusion took place, shots were fired, a person was killed, and turns out unjustly. And that was the beginning of the Detroit race riots. And the city of Detroit was devastated. And I bring that up only to try to modernize some of the thoughts. Because with all of those things happening, you've got a story of a guy named Elijah McCoy. And Elijah McCoy, his mom and dad escaped slavery in Kentucky. And what's one of the big things still produced in Kentucky today? We say bourbon now. Yeah, whiskey, but tobacco. Some big tobacco farms, much less today than, say, 30 years ago. So what kind of farm do you think, or plantation do you think Mr. and Mrs. McCoy were? What kind of, they were slaves, or what kind of a plantation do you think they worked on? Tobacco, there you go. So the McCoys escaped in what's called the Underground Railroad. And this was a series of, for the most part, churches, but religious groups, people that disagreed with slavery, and they helped African American slaves from the south to the north. And Mr. and Mrs. McCoy made it to Detroit. But they realized that the laws at the time allowed the slave owners to come north and capture the slaves and bring them back to the south. And so the McCoys went into Canada, just across the Detroit River into Canada, because Canada had abolished slavery long ago. And this was in 1839. And in 1943, the McCoys had a son named Elijah. And Elijah was educated in the Canadian public schools in Colchester, Canada. I had no idea when we were going to the cottage that there was such a person named Elijah McCoy. Got a great education, and at age 15, he graduated from high school. And he was so good, and there were enough teachers that had connections. They said, he's got a great math mind. He's a really good thinker. And they arranged for him to have an apprenticeship and to go to Edinburgh University and to become an engineer. By the time he finished in Edinburgh, his parents had moved to Ypsilanti, Michigan, because they knew there were some opportunities, and Michigan had passed a law making it illegal for free slaves or blacks to be, quote unquote, repatriated back to their southern slave owners. And so it was now pretty darn safe for the Underground Railroad to stop in Michigan and not to have to go all the way to Canada, although Canada's a great place to go too. And so here is this young, black, now Canadian American. His family had received American citizenship. He became an American. He's an engineer at the time, the world's greatest engineering school. The Scottish Industrial Revolution was the cornerstone of technological invention and innovation at the time. In the 1800s, you look at the ideas, the patents that came out of Scotland, and this young man was trained and was an honor student there. But he comes back, he comes to the United States, he's got this great credential. You think America welcomed him with open arms? And said, hey, Elijah, come on, work with us. Couldn't get a job. Could not get a job as an engineer. So he went to the railroad that went right through Ypsilanti. You can, if you ever go from Ypsilanti, or if you go to downtown Ann Arbor, there's a restaurant in downtown Ann Arbor, used to be a train station. Ken's been there before. Pam and I have been there, called the Gandy Dancer. That's the old train station. And that's the line that Elijah McCoy used to work on. And he couldn't get a job as an engineer. So they gave him a job close to it. And they made him an oiler. And anybody know what an oiler did on a train? What do you think? What were trains powered by back then? They were powered by coal, you're right. But were they powered by coal, or did the coal was used to do what? Very good. Coal was used to create steam. And so it was the steam that moved the engine, moved the gears, right? Moved the crankshaft, the drive shaft, right? But the problem is that you are constantly having to oil and lubricate the moving parts of the engine. And the point is that trains were incredible invention. You know, they were incredibly expensive. They made travel dramatically less expensive. They made the ability to move things like lumber or raw materials. I forget what they were talking about. Productivity innovations with trains were thousands of % increases, or caused that type of an increase. But the point was that trains only moved about 3 to maybe 4 hours at a time. And then the train had to stop to cool down, because the moving parts became so hot that if the train went more than 4 hours, the engine seized up and you blew the bearings and had to rebuild the engine. So what would happen is the train would go for about 4 hours, it would stop, it would cool down, they'd refill the boiler with water and they'd move forward. And here's this engineer named Elijah McCoy. He's watching how this functions. And he's an oiler, he's not an engineer. He's not working on the inner workings and design of the steam engines. And he's thinking to himself, you know, if we can figure out a way to get this engine constantly lubricated, trains could go for 10 hours, 20 hours. You might have overnight travel. You wouldn't have to stop the train, get off the train while it's cooling down, refueling, and the only thing the train would have to do is stop for water. And you could even have a couple of water cars behind you if you wanted to. And so Elijah McCoy invented one of the great inventions. It's in the Inventors World Hall of Fame. It's considered to be one of the top 100 inventions of all time. He invented the automatic boiler system so that you were constantly moving oil around the engine. And much of his invention and subsequent inventions were used in automobiles and many other types of engines moving forward. So when you think about it, and somebody asks you, hey, is that the real McCoy? That's where the phrase comes from. Because the trained pilots, oftentimes called engineers, they weren't really engineers, but the people that drove the trains began to become picky. And they would say, I'm not driving a train that doesn't have the McCoy oiler system. And then there were people that tried to do knockoffs of the McCoy oiler system. But the point is, he dramatically changed the world. The American economy leapfrogged in terms of productivity. And he overcame the difficulties, the prejudice that he experienced. Once he got the oiler system patented, he left the company, he left the railroad company, and he started his own research and manufacturing firm in downtown Detroit, near 12th Street, near where those 67 riots started. But what happened with McCoy is that he literally created an opportunity for leadership. He trained a lot of individuals. He trained Caucasians, he trained blacks in engineering. He had his own company. By the time he died, he had 57 patents to his name, which was, according to Booker T. Washington, the highest number in the world for an individual at that time. And he also invented one of the modern versions of the ironing board. And he also invented one of the versions of the lawn sprinkler system. So he had a lot of patents in a number of different areas, or a number of key areas. But the thing that's really important, I think, to know, and this was important as Kent and Alan and I were working on the article, is that McCoy never complained. And McCoy just overcame. And when his father came from Canada to Ypsilanti, the reason he came there was because there was a big farm looking for some ways to innovate. And his dad set the stage for him. His dad ended up being very successful as well, because they began to grow tobacco in Michigan. I had no idea he could grow tobacco in Michigan. And he had a very successful, his father had a very successful cigar company. And the family did quite well from that business as well. So when the point regarding entrepreneurship, the point regarding somebody like Elijah McCoy, is that what we need to do is we need to focus on, in my opinion, two things. The greatest power you can give any individual, the greatest tool, the greatest movement to success, the greatest causal factor of success is education. Because education and freedom, people overcome problems all the time. And as you look at somebody like Elijah McCoy, and you look at a lot of other differences, when you look at the collapse of apartheid in South Africa as an example, it was based on using economic power, using economic force. When whites were telling blacks you have to shop late at night or at crummy hours on the weekend, blacks began to boycott white businesses. And then you know what happened? Whites began to realize that black dollars or black Kruger rands spend as well as white rands. And very quickly, the fact of the matter is, the economic market discovered that 75% of the population of South Africa happened to be black. And when blacks rallied their economic power and leveraged it for better conditions, better education, without a major conflict taking place, literally, it transformed the country of South Africa to a country that's still it's the economic powerhouse in Africa, and it's run largely by African leaders. But they didn't change the free market economic system, but they changed education and they changed how people acted and interacted that were much better educated because of the freedom in the new system. So my point with you is, if you look at an Elijah McCoy and you understand where we are today, you say, all right, Nash, there's a lot of stuff out there that African Americans are not doing well today, or that there's prejudice. Well, the bottom line is there's always, probably sadly to say, going to be prejudice. But I have to tell you, I don't know. I grew up in an integrated neighborhood. I grew up in an integrated Catholic high school. And I have to tell you, the progress that I've watched as a person and as an economist is that there's a lot less prejudice today. Do we have a lot more to do? Yes. So one of the things that I would say to you, look at the Selig Center. There's data in our article from the Selig Center. Again, SELIG. And the Selig Center has been tracing purchasing power, which is really your income minus taxes, by ethnic groups since 1990. They do it every year. They come out with a marvelous study. And in 1990, if you looked at the entire purchasing power of the United States, the GDP in purchasing power, what you find out, you have Asians, you have Hispanics, you have African Americans, or blacks, you have Pacific Islanders, and you have whites. And what you'd find out is that the four of the five ethnic codes, the four minority codes, made up about 15.6% of all U.S. purchasing power in 1990. And today, the end of 2022, they make up about 29%. So whites made up about 84% in 1990, and whites today make up about 71%. Now, all populations, all five ethnic codes in America are doing a lot better. But when it comes to economic growth, Asians' economic growth outpaced everyone's at 108%. Hispanics outpaced at 89%. African Americans or blacks outpaced whites. African Americans were at 64%. Whites were at about 46%. And so if you look at the growth in income has favored the minorities. And a lot of it has to do with nothing other than education and entrepreneurship. If you look at the number of African American entrepreneurs, dramatically increasing. Number of African Americans going to business schools, dramatically increasing. Engineering schools, medical schools. All the things that you would hope would happen in a free economy that was a moral and just economy is happening. And in fact, if you take a look at the data and look at African Americans as a group, as a population, about 40 million Americans. And if you look at just the purchasing power GDP according to the ALEC Center, if you said we're going to make African Americans a free and independent country, the GDP in 2022 for African Americans was $1.6 trillion, or roughly the size of Canada. That's how large and powerful the economy of the United States, as contributed by the African American, the black population of the United States. And so when we're talking about progress and have we made progress, the answer is yes. We have more to go in the area of prejudice. We do. But what is the greatest tool for success and change is business and especially entrepreneurship. And so I would simply say to you, ladies and gentlemen, we ought to do everything that we can to celebrate every part of America. What's great about America is that it is a melting pot, or as our former president David Fry used to say, it's a Caesar salad. He didn't like the melting pot example because he said we all become one thing, it all melts together into one. He says we're a garden salad, or we're a Greek salad, or a Caesar salad. You know, one person might be a crouton. Somebody else might be a leaf lettuce. But what binds us together is the what? The dressing. And that's the American competitive free enterprise system. That's the rule of law and the Constitution. So we're all different, but we're bound together by that dressing. And when my wife makes one of her kind of Lebanese style salads, we got everything in there. We have chickpeas, we have tomatoes, we have cucumbers. I'm a carrot usually in the Nash household. But the fact of the matter is we're all bound by that dressing. And so we ought to celebrate our individual differences, and we ought to look at where we are and understand what binds us and what makes us great. And I think today we need to talk more about these successes. We got to talk about the tough times. We ought to figure that, you know, if in our lives we didn't treat somebody right for any reason, but especially gender or race, we ought to figure out why we did it and not do it again. We ought to make certain that we're all not doing it as a society. But we also ought to make certain that we have a free and competitive economy where we can create more and more Elijah McCoys, because that's what's driving this economy forward. It's entrepreneurship, it's education, and it's happening across all genders, it's happening across all ethnic codes, and it is something that we must preserve and we must drive forward at a faster pace to remain the beacon of freedom and an economic powerhouse moving forward. So that is what I encourage you to think about today. When you're reading the article about Elijah McCoy, when you're writing the paper, you know, how in my own way can I make the world a little better place? And maybe I invest in a company, maybe I start a company, maybe I solicit a company that promotes the American competitive free enterprise system and raises all economic votes in the harbor. So with that in mind, I simply say to you, thank you for having me here. And if there's any questions I can answer, I'd love to do so. Thank you again. Thoughts, questions?
Do you believe that there is still, do you think that there is still, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Just come back to me.
Okay. Anybody else?
Oh, I got it now.
Back to you.
There's racial, do you think there's systematic racial discrimination in the United States, and why or not?
Do I think it's systematic?
Yes.
No, I do not. But I do think there is still prejudice, and I do think there are things we need to do better, number one. Number two, I also think that government isn't necessarily the solution to handling problems. When I did my doctorate at Wayne State University. I grew up on the northwest side of the city. And I watched, when I graduated from high school in 1976, and these numbers may not be completely accurate, but at my high school, everybody, just about everybody, probably 96% of us went on to either junior college or a four-year university. And at the same time in Detroit, about 25% of the people that would have started in grade K with me, that were now 18, were graduating from high school, let alone going on to college. And that just shouldn't be happening. But the biggest difference was not racism. The biggest difference was rigor and accountability. And when I was in high school, I had IHM nuns and Jesuit priests. And I'll tell you what, I thought my mother was tough. And then I met Sister Maria Rock. And that truly was her name. And after a couple of times on which I got on her wrong side, I was cured. I was a good kid. And if you ever saw the movie The Blues Brothers, remember at the beginning with the penguin? That was me. And so I think it became a question of discipline. When we say that, there was a time in which you had to give a day's notice in the Detroit public school system that you were gonna do a locker inspection. Now, they teach you in Thug 101. If I tell you, I got to give you a day notice, right? Well, then if I give you a day notice, then you don't bring your gun that day. And then the next time you do an inspection, you bring it, you've got a day in between, or drugs, things like that. At St. Mary's, they made it really clear, we own the lockers. And it didn't matter. They would do a random locker check. And I remember one of my best friends in high school, we ended up not graduating together because he decided that another good Canadian product, Crown Royal, was something he wanted to have in his locker. And somebody let one of the nuns know, and our principal went down the hallway with the master key in the back of the lock and opened it up, and he was gone. His dad was kind of happy because he got his Crown Royal back, but it was a real strong environment for learning. And so the answer is, I do not think it is systemic, but I do think there are things that we can constantly do, and a lot of that is happening through private charities. A lot of that is happening through giving people the chance to come to a school like Northwood, to use dollars, whether they're government dollars, whether they're private dollars, for the kinds of not just education, but training that will allow people to move to the next level. But I think, another way to look at it too, it's interesting, if you analyze the African-American community, it's bipolar in terms of economic growth. African-Americans are among the most rapidly growing income groups in America and among the most rapidly declining or slowest growing groups in terms of per capita income. And so when you look at a lot of the different cases. I'd encourage you to read Thomas Sowell or Walter Williams. Dr. Sowell is out at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. And one of the things that he's done in a number of his books is he's an African-American PhD in economics from, I think the University of Chicago. And he analyzed African-Americans that came to the United States, Black Americans that came to the United States, versus those that were born and educated in the United States. And so at age 18, he began to track a group of students that maybe were educated in Canada or educated in the Caribbean for K through 12. And you know what he found out was that when he tracked them for 10 years, those that had been educated outside of the United States, 10 years later, were making 107% of average American national income. Those that were educated in the United States were making less than 80%. And my numbers may be off a little bit. But what he was pointing out is that both looked the same. So it wasn't an issue of color or race, it was an issue of education. And so again, we ought not say that that's the end all be all. There are a lot of different reasons for problems. But what I have to say is that when we're looking at the key is that when I look at the border, and we had a couple million people crossing into the United States illegally. And we're now saying there was at least 100,000 that came from our northern border. And we know that on the east and west coast, there are a lot of people coming. If this is such a bad country, why are literally millions and millions of people a year trying to get in? We're not perfect, but I don't think we're a systemically racist country. And I know what racism was like. The thing I didn't share with you is that when we crossed the bridge into Detroit, we went down 94 and came around through Dearborn, and then came around Dearborn to get into our home in Northwest Detroit. In Dearborn, where we're at now, as we know, is not part of the city. And Dearborn was a racist city at the time. They had National Guardsmen blocking who could come into the city and who couldn't. But we had to go around because we couldn't go through the middle of the city, which we normally did. We'd come in and go right down Grand River all the way out to our home, and it was beautiful. You know, we went and we'd go by Woodward, Hudson's, that's where the Santa Parade was. At the time, Detroit had one of the top Santa Parades in the country. But my point is, when you look at it, this city, I mean, the country is so much better, but we're not perfect. The solution is education. The solution is getting bright young guys like you and unleashing you in the American economy. But making certain that you have the right education, you have the best education. And so that's my long-winded answer. I'll be quiet. Thank you.
Okay. Take a 5-minute break.
All right.